ayasaba makwala ayasaba makwala tubula kirela ayasaba makwala ayasaba makwala kirela
Scholars argue that the violent fees must fall student protests mirror a troubled South African society.
ayasaba makwala ayasaba makwala.
I believe that what the students have been doing and the concomitant violence, it's a reflection of society. We come from a particular society, and therefore, these are things that reflect who we are. Yes, it might not be the entire society per se, but we have seen how this the flare-up of violence always accompanies even protests within our community. And for me, that says we need to engage in a discussion. That says we need to understand that these are the property, this is our infrastructure. And if we destroy the very same infrastructure that should provide us with an opportunity to better our lives, it becomes a challenge, a very serious challenge. In the end, it also, for me, reflects that perhaps in a moment of anger, people don't think, they don't reflect and think ahead.
I think as institution of higher learning, as researchers, we need to go deep in terms of trying to understand what is behind this violent behavior. Remember, there is nothing wrong with protest. The only problem starts when protests start to assume a violent posture.
Professor Maseremule argues that the violence cannot be seen as an inherent trait of poor societies. Besides, government and institutions have put interventions in place to ease the plight of poor students at universities.
Well, I think that we have a challenge as researchers, as professors, as university, to go back and try to understand exactly what is behind this. Because for me, my contention will obviously be that to just simplistically conclude that what we are seeing mirrors the plight, the socioeconomic plight of where these students come from, for me, is a very simplistic conclusion. There is a bigger research agenda that we need to pursue with the intention of trying to understand exactly what is behind this.
Violent public protests over service delivery have become a norm in South Africa. Some people argue that students have brought that violent social behavior to campuses.
As university, we have got the responsibility to authenticate the correctness of certain things that have been said out there. There might be some correlation, but the question is, does that account to the totality of what you are seeing on campus? And perhaps one can caution that we should try to always act on the basis of a scientifically authenticated fact. Because you'll recall that in 1976, the condition, the system there was so brutal, and inevitably, students had to act the way they did. Because also remember what they did then, it was part of the program to fight a brutal system. But now things have changed. We are living in a democracy. Why isn't that in a democracy there is so much predilection or propensity to propensity to violence in student activism? Is this a manifestation of radical student activism or sheer acts of criminality?
And I would say that it is not a question of just one of academics talking about it or students talking about it. It is a societal issue. And it is deeper than just the fees must fall, in my view. The question we are dealing with is one of a society which was injured seriously injured during the colonial apartheid era. People mobilized in various phases, women marching to the union buildings. You have the Sharpeville massacres. You have student uprising in the 70s. They were not violent as such. They were protesting, demonstrating, and that's why our Constitution really entrenches the right of people to petition, to demonstrate, and so on. And that is a right that people must have. So toying and so on is wonderful, musical. It is wonderful to watch. Where the problem is the violence. Where is this violence coming from when even the Constitution makes it very clear that you can demonstrate, you can protest, but peacefully? How do we deal with that mental and psychological anger within the population in the country? We have to deal with that. We are not dealing with it properly. So our education system is part of that protest we see out there. The way in which our curriculum is structured, built, and the people who actually educate are part of that problem.
I think from where I'm sitting, there are quite a number of issues that we need to take into consideration in order to understand the whole fees must fall movement. Yes, there have been expectations, some of which arose from promises made in political promises that were made and expectations that naturally people had as we got into the new South Africa. And within that context, I think it is within that context that we need to begin to locate this whole process, because we need also to understand that the Fees Must Fall campaign, with all its attendant challenges, fundamentally, and if you look at the context, you will find that nobody really disagrees with the fundamental aim of the movement. However, there have been unintended, or at least from where we are sitting, unintended ramifications and consequences.
Are we perhaps seeing poor management of stakeholder issues here?
The 2016 strike would have been averted had management engaged us on our issues. We managed to avoid the strike in 2015 because management engaged us then. In 2016, our strike was more about student safety and security than about tuition fees. The protest intensified when student leaders were detained and followers demanded their release from custody. The leaders had been arrested under questionable circumstances.
I will defend my peers, whether they are vice-chancellors or my colleagues, the deputy vice-chancellors. There's no way any vice-chancellor or deputy vice-chancellor would not engage with students over these issues. So the issue of dialogue, the issue of engagement, the issue of connection with students is a fundamental principle of university management. But the issue is when these meetings take place, obviously, in some cases in a meeting, you have more hawks than doves. So when you have more hawks than doves in a meeting, then the meeting gets stalled. But most of the people that lead these institutions are very good managers, experienced managers. Some of them are even students themselves of organizational behavior and how you build a culture in an institution, a culture of engagement and a culture of dialogue. So my take on this is that in most institutions, that's why we've got student representative councils, so that these are structures that then engage with management.
He was a buffalo soldier.
Other commentators have argued that society turns violent when they feel that their issues are not responded to. But whether universities or government could have done things differently is not the issue. Rather, the question is, what must be done to get universities out of this conundrum?
I basically think that this is something that calls for us to begin to engage seriously, not just for the sake of engaging, but to enter into some kind of national dialogue insofar as what needs to happen. Primarily because, as you already know, there are a number of impacts that the movement has had, and some of them which in the long term may end up being very self-defeatist, as it were. So I think as part of that discourse and the dialogue, we will need to begin to re-educate ourselves and our students to understand, or to an understanding, that legitimate as their calls may be, there are better ways of dealing with things.
What I'm suggesting is that we now need to engage in dialogue with our students so that our students understand, that whole area of economics of education. When you talk free education, what exactly do you mean? If we don't get fees, where are we going to get the funding to pay the academics? Where are we going to get funding for research? Where are we going to get funding for infrastructure, innovation, for new buildings, etc., etc.? So that dialogue is critical. That understanding is critical. That engagement is critical, so that 2017, we don't have any closures.
Professor Shadrach Guto is calling for a serious relook into the curriculum offered at universities. Does it prepare graduates for the challenges of life, or was it merely cut from systems elsewhere and pasted into the African system?
So we need education systems that are going to help us to correct all of this, build a healthy, prosperous, happy society. Where do we begin? We begin by understanding the reality, understanding the problem, and why the problem is there.
Numerous scholars are calling for a national dialogue to find out where things went wrong in South Africa. Society needs to resolve this violent culture. Under the leadership of former Deputy Chief Justice Dikgang Moseneke, a national dialogue is being mobilized involving all sectors of the nation with intent to take a broad social approach and to work towards some kind of a social pact for South Africa. May we succeed in this collective endeavor.